Water is literally the lifeblood of our planet, but it's facing this constant and often totally invisible threat. So today we're going to dive deep into the really complex world of aquatic pollution and figure out what's actually going on just beneath the surface.
Okay, so when you hear water pollution, this is probably what pops into your head, right? It's a gut punch. You see all that trash and you just think, can't we just scoop all that out and be done with it?
And that right there is the big question. If the problem is staring us right in the face, why is it one of the most stubborn environmental challenges we're up against? Well, it turns out the real issue is way, way deeper than what we can see floating on top.
So, to get to the bottom of this, we really have to uncover our water's hidden threat. Let's break down why this is such a complicated and, frankly, sneaky problem.
Let's start with the basics. What even is pollution? At its simplest, it's any unwanted change in the environment that can hurt living things. And I mean any living thing, from the tiniest microbe all the way up to us.
So what makes this whole thing such a headache to track? Well, for starters, we often don't even know what clean looks like. We don't have a baseline for the natural levels of a lot of this stuff. Then, the effects, they don't happen overnight. They can creep up on you over years. And on top of all that, pollutants sneak into the water in a ton of different ways, and the sheer number of chemicals we humans are pumping out there is just enormous. It's a huge task.
Okay, that sounds super complex, right? So let's try to simplify it. We can basically boil it down to two main highways that pollution uses to get into our water.
All right, on one side, you've got what's called point source pollution. Super simple. Think of a single pipe dumping waste from a factory. You can literally point to it. But then on the other side, you've got non-point source pollution. And this is where things get really tricky. It comes from everywhere and nowhere all at once, like all the runoff from farms and city streets when it rains.
And this diagram, it shows the difference perfectly. See those pipes from the factory and the treatment plant? Bam! Point sources. Easy. But now, look at everything else. The runoff from the crops, the city, the suburbs. All that gunk trickling into the river from all over the place? That's your non-point source pollution, and it's so much harder to pin down.
Okay, so we know how it gets in. Now let's talk about what this pollution actually is. We can sort of break it down into three main types, what I like to call the three faces of contamination.
Here's our roadmap for this section. Pretty much every pollutant you can think of fits into one of these three buckets: physical, chemical, and biological. Let's go through them one by one.
First up, we've got the physical stuff. This is the pollution you can often see, touch, or smell. We're talking trash, sediment from eroded soil, all that floating junk. It messes with the water's most basic qualities: the color, how clear it is, the taste, and even weird things like foam from detergents.
Yeah, take a look at this picture. That is not your normal breezy day at the beach sea foam. Nope. This thick, gunky foam is a classic sign of pollution, usually from detergents or some kind of industrial waste. It's a huge, visible red flag.
All right, phase number 2, chemical pollutants. This is the stuff that's usually invisible, which makes it even scarier. It can be organic stuff, like pesticides and oil spills, or it can be inorganic, things like toxic heavy metals, mercury, lead, plus excess nutrients and even acids from factories.
And our third and final phase is biological pollution. This is literally a living threat. We're talking about pathogens, bacteria, viruses, parasites that get into our water from things like raw sewage. These are the infectious microbes that make people seriously sick.
So we've got all these different types of pollution coming from all these different places. What's the result? Well, what happens next is like a horrifying domino effect, a cascade of consequences that ripples through the entire ecosystem. And the very first domino to get knocked over is biodiversity. Pollution makes the water toxic or unlivable for many species. The sensitive ones die out first, and when they disappear, the whole food web starts to wobble and collapse.
And it's not just about killing animals directly. It's about destroying their homes. Think about it. An oil spill completely smothers a coral reef. Runoff carrying tons of sediment can bury the gravel beds where fish need to lay their eggs. Their homes are literally being wiped off the map.
Now this is a perfect example of what's called eutrophication. Sounds complicated, but here's the deal. Chemical pollutants, especially nutrients from fertilizers, act like steroids for algae. You get these massive blooms, and when all that algae dies, the bacteria that decompose it just suck all the oxygen out of the water. It creates these huge dead zones where nothing can survive.
And you know what? This isn't just an ecological problem. It hits us right in the wallet. Fisheries collapse. It costs more and more money to make our water drinkable. Who wants to vacation at a polluted beach? And of course, there are the massive healthcare costs from all the sickness it causes.
And that brings us to maybe the most terrifying impact of all, the cost to our own health. How does this stuff actually get from the river into our bodies?
Well, one of the sneakiest ways is something called bioaccumulation. Here's how it works. Heavy metals like mercury get into the water. Tiny organisms absorb it. Then a small fish eats a bunch of those tiny organisms. Then a bigger fish eats a bunch of those small fish. See what's happening? At every single step up the food chain, that poison gets more and more concentrated. By the time it gets to a human who eats that big fish, the dose can be incredibly dangerous, causing all sorts of terrible health problems. But hey, the threat isn't always that complicated. Sometimes it's brutally direct. Just drinking, swimming, or even touching water that's full of those biological pollutants, those germs we talked about, is one of the biggest causes of disease on the planet. And the human toll, it's just awful. You've got immediate, nasty intestinal infections like cholera and typhoid. You have viral diseases like polio and hepatitis. And then you have the long game from the chemical exposure. Cancer, hormone disruption, a weakened immune system. It's a huge price to pay.
So, let's pull it all together. We've seen that pollution has these different faces: physical, chemical, biological. It finds its way into our water from everywhere, setting off this chain reaction of damage to nature, to our economy, and to our own bodies. And that leaves us with one last really big question to think about. If this pollution is coming from everywhere, a factory pipe, a farm, our own streets, where on earth does the responsibility to fix it even begin?